Welcome to Cool Talk and the British Civil War. Now, many remember the French Revolution and the American Revolution, but the British Civil War had far-reaching consequences that actually influenced the other revolutions. And religion, as usual, played a huge part. We're going to begin with Henry VIII and his several wives. His first wife was Catherine of Aragon. He wanted to have a son. He needed an heir. She gave him a daughter named Mary, but she also had 7 miscarriages, and King Henry was, frankly, tired. He wanted to annul the marriage, but the Catholic Church wouldn't do it. So he separated from the church anyway, started the Church of England, and he was the supreme head. This had tremendous repercussions. Henry VIII had several of his closest advisors who opposed this beheaded. He annulled the marriage anyway, married Anna Boleyn, had a daughter named Elizabeth, and he loved Anna Boleyn, but then he accused her of high treason and had her beheaded. He then married Jane Seymour, a Catholic. She gave Henry a son, Edward, but then she later died from postnatal complications. His fourth wife was Anne of Cleves, a Protestant. Henry married her, but then he found her ugly. It was a political arrangement. He never consummated the marriage and divorced her. His fifth wife was Catherine Howard. By this time, Henry was 49 years old and fat. She was 16 and pretty. Well, she cheated on him and he had her beheaded. He married for the final time to Catherine Parr. They were married on July 12, 1543, and 4 years later, Henry died. So, Henry's son Edward, the son of his third wife, becomes king. But he would die young. He would die at 15 years old, leaving a vacuum on the throne. Henry's daughter, the daughter of his first wife, Mary I, became queen. Now, Mary was a strict Catholic, and she wanted to reverse the Reformation. Protestants were persecuted. Hundreds were executed, and she was known as Bloody Mary. She even imprisoned her half-sister Elizabeth. But Mary dies, and her half-sister Elizabeth I becomes Queen of England, daughter of Anne Boleyn. She never married, and she was called by many the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth was much more tolerant than Mary. She was challenged by many people, especially her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who was later beheaded. She faced several assassination attempts, slander, and betrayal. And perhaps because of this, her successes were done in half measures, like baby steps, no real bold moves, but she was more influential than you might think. She took England and pushed it toward its becoming eventually an empire. She helped defeat the Spanish Armada and built an English navy, superior to any in the world. In the end, she reigned England for 44 years. When Elizabeth died, she had no child, so she had no heir. She named her cousin James, the King of Scotland, to be the King of England. Now, James I becomes King of England and Scotland. He's very full of himself. He believes in the divine right of kings. He hated dealing with the Parliament. He would ignore them. And despite angering the nobles, merchants and those represented by the House of Commons had to deal with him. James was a Protestant, but he was an expert at getting the Catholics and Protestant noble factions to fight each other. Another thing that James did was commission the translation of the Bible into English, which is why this old Bible is known as the King James Bible. It was around this time that a group of extreme fundamentalist Protestants appeared. They were the Puritans. When James I died, his son Charles I becomes king, and he also hates working with the Parliament. He even dismissed the Parliament in 1629 and governed alone for 11 years. He persecuted the Puritans, and many of them fled to the Americas in 1630. Followers of the king were called Cavaliers, and they went so far as to have troops invade the House of Commons in Parliament. Now, the British Civil War began in 1642. The people struck back at the king, and a Puritan by the name of Oliver Cromwell trained the armies and won battle after battle after battle. until he captured King Charles I and had him beheaded in the town square in 1649. So now there was no king. Parliament declared England a commonwealth and free state, without a king in the House of Lords. This was easier said than done, as royalists, the military, landowners, and merchants continuously quarreled. So Oliver Cromwell took over and abolished the Parliament. He became what he called the Lord Protector of England, which is kind of like saying, I'm not the king, but I am the boss. Now, Cromwell actually believed in religious tolerance, but with all the infighting, he felt that he had to rule as a military dictator. And as a Puritan, he closed down the theaters and the alehouses. He prohibited mixed dancing, cockfighting on Sundays were illegal. He believed that all these activities were sinful. By the time Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, many people were sick of Puritanism. And with no strong leader in 1660, the son of Charles I, who was exiled in France, was invited to come back and become king. He accepted. So yes, England was going back to having a monarchy, but this time monarchs would have to rely on the consent of Parliament to levy taxes and make laws. People were given a voice. But Charles II had another matter to deal with. He did not forget that his father, Charles I, was executed by Oliver Cromwell and others. So he had Oliver Cromwell's body and a few others dug up and hung and judged and tried. And then he had their heads cut off from those skeletons and hung up on spikes. Now, Charles II was very popular. Many people considered him kind of a cool dude, happy, easygoing, tolerant, but he was trying to take small steps to restore royal power. He went a little bit too slow, so he didn't do very much. He also favored Roman Catholicism, and he actually became a Catholic on his deathbed. Now, not much happened during his 25-year reign except for two very important things. Number one, the passage of habeas corpus, the right to not be arbitrarily imprisoned. Prisoners had the right to know what their crime was. And number two, the beginnings of political parties. At the time, the parties were the Whigs and the Tories. When Charles died in 1685 without an heir, his brother James II becomes king. Now, James was a very strict Catholic, but the Puritans and the Protestants were accepting of him because James II was very old and his daughters were all Protestants. He had no sons. However, in 1688, his second wife gave birth to a baby boy, and this changed everything. Nobody wanted a young Catholic to eventually become king and govern for many, many years. On top of that, James was a little bit antagonizing to the Whigs and the Tories, so they decided to offer the crown to a man named William III of Orange, a Dutch ruler. Why? Well, he was married to James's daughter, Mary, who was a Protestant, King James' daughter. So, William and Mary arrive in England in 1688 with a large army, and her father, King James II, flees to France. So William and Mary were crowned co-monarchs, but there were conditions, and many of them were elaborated in the Bill of Rights of 1689, guaranteeing the freedom of speech to Parliament, forbidding the king from interfering with Parliament's elections and meetings, guaranteeing several rights to the people to petition the government, forbidding excessive bail, and banning illegal use of the army. If this all sounds familiar, it's because a lot of this was the basis for the Declaration of Independence in the Americas and also the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen during the French Revolution. Very influential. So it's easy to say that the Bill of Rights led the way for these future democratic revolutions. I want to mention another development that happened at the time. Parliament and the king would choose its ministers from the majority party, meaning if there were more Whigs than Tories in Parliament, then the minister should be a Whig too. And if the Whig Party lost its majority years later, then the minister had to resign and the new minister was chosen from the Tory party. This was how it was for a while at the time. Now, this minister was called the principal minister, and later that was changed to the prime minister. Now, England history, after all of this, would get into several wars with France, economic problems, and this would lead to turmoil with their colonies over in the Americas. And in our next video, we're going to talk about the next democratic revolution, the American Revolution. But in the meantime, comment below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.